Hey, what's going on YouTube? It's the brain of the mainframe here, Nile Scala with the POPXP, and I'm here with an exciting interview, one that I'm looking forward to, because every now and then, something comes across your screen, your desk, an email, and what happened for me a few days back is a book came up. I saw an article, and that book happened to be Invisible Men, the Trailblazing Black Artists of Comic Books by Ken Quattro. And I've been fortunate enough to actually reach out to Ken, and he has politely and willing to come on the show to talk to me. So I'm very excited to discuss this book with him, his career. He's quite a fascinating gentleman. So without further ado, everyone, let me please welcome Ken Quattro to the show. Ken, how are you?
I'm great. Now, how are you doing?
I am doing fantastic, and I have to say it was funny. I was scrolling through Facebook, and it was I think it was comicbooks.com, and there was an article for Invisible Men, and I saw it. And anything Golden Age comic book related, I'm in love with that art style. It's the thing that caught me even as a young child. It's always the books I gravitated towards. And I saw the cover, and I immediately stopped. And I'm like, "What's this?" And I clicked on it. I read the article, which was the Los Angeles. Not Times, Daily News, Los Angeles Daily News. And I read through the article and I was like, I have to get this guy on the show. This looks absolutely incredible. But before we get into discussing your book, which is gorgeous, by the way, even just in quality of cover and pages and content, I'd really like to get to know you, because that article was my first introduction to yourself. So if you don't mind, give us a little bit of your origin story. How did you get into comics and where you are today with your books?
Okay, well, I started reading comics actually 60 years ago, in about a month. So I give you an idea how old I am. Okay. Well, anyways, I'm from the Detroit area, and the timing was almost perfect, because that year was the year that obviously the Fantastic Four started and Marvel, the whole Marvel age began. So I was in on a lot of early comic book fandoms, particularly here in Detroit. And we had some of the earliest Comic-Cons. There was a thing called the Detroit Triple Fanfare, which is set up by a guy named Jerry Bales, Dr. Jerry Bales, who was a professor at Wayne State University. And some of the people who helped him set it up was Rich Buckler and Shel Dorf and these other people who were in the comic industry later on, but they were younger at the time. Well, Jerry Bales used to write letters to the letter columns in the Silver Age comic books, particularly DC Comics, talking about these older comic books that came out in the 1940s. Well, for me, a kid who was just growing up in the 1960s, wouldn't even know that there was comic books back in the 1940s. I mean, that was like talking about the Civil War era to me. But anyways, that drew me into the older comics. And these first couple of Comic-Cons I went to, which were basically just held in a hotel room, just about maybe 100 people, would show up. I'd start buying these Golden Age comics, and I met Jerry Bales. I met these other early comic collectors. And anyway, that's what got me hooked on, comics in general, but specifically Golden Age comics. And Dr. Bales was really the first comic fan to give comic books a historical treatment. Being an academic and everything himself, he did a lot of historical research, and a lot of what we know today came from Jerry Bales' early work. About these artists and writers and stuff. So that really hooked me. So starting right around 1970, and I started doing my own research into the careers of a lot of these artists and writers. Well, I always wanted to be a comic book artist myself, like a lot of kids, and I went to art school, and I studied journalism and everything, to try to hone my craft. But I never ended up working as a professional. But I always was connected to comics, and I continued doing all this research. And over the years, I've written thousands, literally, of articles and contributed to books. I've helped on some movies as a historical consultant, like the movie Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman that came out a couple of years ago. I was the historical consultant on that film. But that's my specialty. Is what I do is I look at not just the comic book character. I look at the people behind the comics, the people who created the comics, and I put it into a historical perspective. in the sense of like, where do comic books fit in that portion of history? I take a much more macro view of comics history than a lot of people do. A lot of people will focus on just one writer or artist or a particular comic. I look at everything that's going on around it. And that's where my research comes in. And that's what I've been doing for years now. I've been on the internet for 20 some years, and I've had several different blogs, and I'm involved in a lot of historians groups and stuff like that. And that's kind of my background there.
Yeah. Now, do you find like with, I notice, you know, as a comic collector, as an aspiring creator, as a host, I do find that the conversation of comic history about, you know, a lot of the older creators and artists out there, I mean, it seems to be funneled to really a select few books. Do you feel that the respect for the true history of comics is actually out there, or is it a very narrow market for the interest?
Well, see, it's funny you bring that up now. See, I've always kind of swam against the mainstream of comics history and comics historians because of the type of view I take. Fortunately and unfortunately, most comics history comes from comic fans. And being fans, people tend to focus just on what they like. You know, the focus on superhero comics has distorted the view of comics history, because for long portions of comics history, superheroes weren't that important.
Correct.
They were important from like about 1938 when Superman, you know, came on the scene into about the end of World War II. But then from the end of World War II and almost up until the Marvel age, superheroes were a secondary genre. Dell comics were far more popular in the late 1950s than any superhero comics, you know. And so what has happened is we have a distorted view, a very myopic view of comics history. And that's why it's exciting to me that The Invisible Men is getting so much attention right now, because it's exposing people to comics history as like, and as I train in art school, there's like art history.
Yeah.
I mean, when you study art history, you know, you study the Renaissance, you study, you know, the Medicis and stuff like that. If you study, you know, the postmodern or German expressionism, there's a lot of sociological things come in, a lot of cultural things that affected, you know, art. And it's the same thing with comic books. And that's what I tried getting across here in Invisible Men, is that, you know, these specific men that I focused on here, yes, they did comic books, but there's so much more to these men than just the comic books that they did. And that's the way I wish more people would approach comics history, because I think it makes it more palatable to the public in general, you know, to have access to it. Like I've told several people, I say, I look at the comic books as an entry point into the lives of these men, not the full scope of their lives. Because many comic artists, as you well know, only work in comic books for a certain period of time during their careers. You know, a lot of times they did stuff before and afterwards, especially the Golden Age artists. You know, they went on to commercial art or advertising or something else. You know, so I've interviewed many Golden Age artists over the years, and they really have to think about what they did as working in comic books, because that was, you know, 40 years before. And it was just, that's saying like, you know, somebody coming up and you say like, well, do you remember working at McDonald's when you were 16? You know, it's the same kind of thing.
It was their entry level, right? Working in the comics was their entry level to get into the marketing and the other big industries. Because comics in the Golden Age, they weren't money makers for the artists or the writers.
They work for the publishers. I mean, they were spending money, you know, for the publishers. But for anybody in art, it was the lowest rung of commercial art. Will Eisner always said, he said comic books were lower on the ladder than pornography. You know, at the time, as far as public, well, it's true, because a lot of pornographers were also comic book publishers, and that was like a sideline for them. You know, so we have a very skewed view of comic book history, and that's what I've been trying to do for 50 years now, is try to say like, wait a minute, there's much more here. It's a far richer history than we give it credit for.
Yeah, and I love when people take the time to really get passionate about the history of really anything that they're into.
Right.
Because they start peeling back layers in such an efficient manner that you start to really see the people that may have inspired the Ditkos and the Kirbys and this and that, the guys that may have created certain stuff. Like, I mean, we all know, even with some of the famous superheroes that we have with Batman and Superman, there was other layers to the creativity. It may have not necessarily been, Bob Kane that developed, or whatnot. There's a bunch of different layers here of people that didn't get credit. And what's nice is when someone like yourself takes the time to just slowly peel back each layer and examine everything, like, well, actually, this person did this and this influenced this, and they had an involvement in that. And if it wasn't for this, if it wasn't for Fred here, this wouldn't have happened. And you really get to dive deep into the culture of comics and the creation of comics, character development, story development. Yes. And it's definitely something that I'd have to say I'm thankful there are gentlemen in the world like yourself that are doing the work that I don't, because you're exposing me to knowledge I need to know for the craft I love.
Well, like I say, my hope, Niles, is that more people pick up on this stuff. I even say that later in the book, towards the end of the book. I say, this is just a starting point. I don't want everybody to think that this is the definitive word on these 18 Black artists or just on Black artists in general or comics history in general. It's not. I said, it's a starting point. I hope that people come along and do more research, and find more things and find more people who have not gotten credit. I mean, there were literally thousands of guys who worked in the comic book industry back in the 1940s and 50s. We happen to focus on about 100.
Yeah.
And they're mostly superhero artists. I mean, Jack Kirby was great. Okay. Loved Jack Kirby. But Jack Kirby wasn't the only great comic book artist at that time. And even in the people who worked in the industry at that time, he wasn't considered the greatest, comic book artist and stuff. It was just he happened to be great at what he did, and he became popular, particularly later on. And it's not denigrating, Mr. Kirby's memory or anything like that. It's putting everything in perspective, and it's.
Well, he was on the right books at the right time, and that's what took off. So, and he was the artist for it. So he got, the notoriety. Of course, there's always someone better, but if they're not working on the right IP at the right time, they're not going to get the notoriety.
Exactly. I mean, you had guys like Lou Fine and Mac Raboy and stuff like that. They're fantastic artists. I mean, just general natural artists. Matt Baker, one of the people I write about in the book. Just natural talents were great artists in that. But in popularity-wise, they're nowhere near as well known as a Kirby or whoever else you may focus on.
Now, before we get into Invisible Men, as a comic book historian, what are some of the other books you have out there or good articles that you would recommend the viewers take a look at?
Well, this is the only book with my name on the cover. I've contributed to many, many books, everything from, like Joe Laporte's Secret Life of Wonder Woman and stuff like that. I mean, a lot of people have used me as a resource, or I've written articles for. As far as like articles, I've written for a Comics Journal, Alter Ego. There's one out now called Hoo Ha that I've written for. A number of places. And seems sometimes when I look at Wikipedia, it seems like half the things in Wikipedia were taken from something I've written at one time or another.
It probably was.
If you just Google my name in that, you'll find links to many online articles. Because like I said, I've been doing this for years, and I always post stuff like on Facebook. I'll write an entire article. I've written a 50-page article one time I posted on Facebook. That went on and on and on. I put it over several different, days, but that's what I'll do. A lot of times I'll just freely put my stuff up there and, just people access it, but it's easy to find it. You just put my name in Google and there's all kinds of stuff out there.
There you go. So we have Invisible Men. I got my copy the other day. I'm in the process of reading it. So far, I think it's incredible. An amazing book. So let me ask you, why now? Why this book?
Well, it's not something that happened overnight, and it's almost coincidental that it came out in this time in history, because it started almost 20 years ago. And I was writing an article, and I wanted to write an article about Matt Baker in particular, because he's one of my favorite artists. But the only thing that most people knew at the time 20 years ago was that Matt Baker died young, and he was black. And a lot of people, there was always the almost like the legend, oh, he was the only black artist who worked in comics in the 1940s, which statistically didn't even make sense. I mean, how's that even possible? So I always thought that was curious. So I, tried for years to try to find out anything about him personally. Finally, somebody, and I can't remember who it was, gave me the name of Mr. Samuel Joyner, who was a retired black cartoonist living in Philadelphia. And I located him, I found his address, and I wrote him a letter. Well, I was used to, a lot of times I would write letters to these golden age artists and stuff, and you'd never get a response.
Yeah.
You get a 1 or 2 line response because people are hesitant, to respond to somebody they don't know. Well, Mr. Joyner wrote me back a beautiful 4-page letter, and he gave me a whole packet of clippings and newspaper articles and photocopies of different black artists that he'd known. And some had worked in comics, but there's other ones like E. Sims Campbell and Ted Shearer who were known outside of comics, but they were black cartoonists. Mm-hmm. Well, that just stunned me, Nile, at the time. I'm going like, wait a minute. Why hasn't anybody ever said anything about this before? So I wrote him back, and he wrote me back a little more about himself. And, he visited Matt Baker in his studio. He visited Elmer Stoner. He visited E. Sims Campbell. He actually met these men. And so that got me going. So I started doing my normal research, looking up these men in archives, like I normally do, like newspaper archives, to see if there's any personal information. Well, there was nothing I could find. So I said, well, that's really weird. I said, because almost every artist leaves a trail somewhere along the line, like, they'll show up in exhibitions in newspapers, or they'll, there'll be personal information in newspapers and, or genealogical research. I couldn't find anything. So I said, wait a minute, what about black newspapers? Mm-hmm. So I started looking for black newspaper archives, which there was, at that time, there was almost none, because unfortunately, libraries didn't keep black newspapers. They would hang on to the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, but not black newspapers. So it was a very spotty beginning to my research. It's only in random places I would come across these newspapers. Over time, I started building up almost like my own database of stuff. And as I did, I started finding references to these different black cartoonists. And it turns out, not only were they cartoonists, but most of them were fine artists. They were culturally trained fine artists, and they would be like painters, and they'd have exhibitions, or they'd have a comic strip that ran in a black newspaper or something. So it was a process that took me over 15 years to build all this information about these artists. And I developed the entire scope of what they did in the world they lived in. Because as you go through the book, you'll see like there's connections between almost all of them. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of overlap between a lot of them. And it's just they all happen to work in comic books, but they work in comic books almost coincidentally, because as they went through their lives, almost all of them had careers beyond comics. Well, they all had careers beyond comics, but most of them went on to art careers, like as painters or teachers, or they became social activists or something else. And comic books are only a small portion of what they did. Mm-hmm. So it's, like I say, it just developed over 15 years, and the timing of it coming out now is coincidental more than anything else, because it took that long for me to put it all in a coherent form and to get it all put together.
Now you have so many artists in this book, and I mean, from researching them, and you're talking, you say it's a very difficult process because a lot of stuff wasn't saved. There weren't things saved. I mean, how did you go about researching each artist?
Like I say, it was just a matter of following crumbs, of following threads. Mm-hmm. I'm obsessive when it comes to research. Okay, I do go down rabbit holes that a normal person wouldn't do. I'll follow things. It's hard to explain my process, my wife thinks I'm crazy, but she's a very patient woman. That's why I dedicate. Yeah. But I'll follow things to ridiculous extents, and it took a super amount of research to put all this stuff together. That's all I could say about it. I mean,
did you were able to reach out to family members or anything like that?
No, see, that was part of the problem too, because most of these men at the time when I started the book had already died. Okay.
Yeah. And
a couple others, as I developed, information about them, I had no way of getting hold of them. And the last one who died was Cal Massey. He died last year. Luckily, there had been an interview with him before he died, though, that showed up at Alter Ego that helped a little bit. But I do all my own primary research. I do all my digging and everything myself, because that's part of a journalistic bent in me, is that I don't trust anything unless I can verify it myself. I like to have 2 or 3 sources for everything I do. And you'll come across some myth busting that I do in this book here, because there's different stories about different artists that prove not to be true, but that I found the truth about through primary research and reading actual contemporaneous articles and interviews done with these guys at the time.
Incredible. Now, let me ask you a question. We all kind of know how the times were then, yes. Right? We know how the segregation, we know how everything was set up between whites and blacks. With the black artists in their history, do you feel it was it whitewashed for them? Or they kind of just, no one really gave them the credit they needed, and it only went to the certain creators or artists?
It was, I have to explain sort of like the circumstances of how they even got to work in comic books. In the 1930s, there's a thing called the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which was created by the Roosevelt administration. And what it was, the purpose of the WPA was to give artists jobs, because during the Depression, everybody was out of work. So what the WPA did is it created jobs for artists, and they do things like paint murals on post offices, or they worked in the World's Fair or something like that. Well, it was mostly minority artists who worked for WPA, black and Jewish artists. In 1939 and 1940, though, Congress defunded the WPA. So all these artists lost their jobs. And a lot of these artists, again, being minority artists, didn't have access to the higher rungs of commercial art or anything else. And that was not just black, it's also Jewish ones. There's artists like, for instance, Mac Raboy or Bernie Krigstein was also a WPA artist. Louis Fairstadt was a WPA artist, okay? Well, all these black artists were originally WPA artists. So around 1939 and 40, they had no way of making a living. It's great to be a fine artist and a painter, but it's hard to make a living at it, because you might spend 6 months on a painting and that doesn't pay the bills.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like comic books became almost like a natural place for them to go. And the other thing that helped them out was the fact that World War II started, in late 41. Well, even though blacks were eligible to be drafted, draft boards would not take a draft, would not draft a black man in the early years of the war. It wasn't until 1943 or 44 the local draft boards would draft them, because they considered blacks to be unpatriotic. They didn't know if they were loyal enough to be drafted and used as soldiers. So as the white soldiers or white artists were drafted and became soldiers, the blacks were still left at home. And just like the Rosita Riveters working in the plants,
yep.
Women taking the men's jobs, it was the blacks were taking the white jobs in the comic industry. And the other thing that helped them out was the creation of comic shops, which were comic studios. I don't know if you're familiar with the comic studios of the 30s and 40s, but it was what they were is they were packagers. Comic books weren't created the way they are nowadays, where a particular artist would get an assignment from the publisher and go off and draw that comic book. Back in the day, a publisher would work with a studio and they'd call them comic shops. And what it'd be a guy like Will Eisner or Lloyd Jacquet or Harry Chesler would go to a publisher and say, like, what do you need? And the publisher would say, I need 2 64-page comic books by next week. Okay. Mm-hmm. So they would get that job. They would take it back to their studio. Okay. And what their studio was basically just a big empty room lined up with drawing desks. Okay. Drawing tables. Artists literally just sitting there elbow to elbow, cranking out these comic books as fast as they could. That's why a lot of the artwork is really crappy in Golden Age comics. Mm-hmm. It's because it had nothing to do with quality. It had to do with quantity. Like, get it out as fast as you can. Well, the comic shops offered the black artist an added bonus in that by the packager being the one who would deal with the publisher and the editor, a black artist didn't have to walk in there personally to try to get a job. Mm-hmm. Because I read interviews with several of these different black artists, and they said that was always a problem they had. Anytime they had to walk into an office to try to get a job from an editor, they were almost always turned down. But by working through these packagers, these comic shops, they had that buffer between them and the publisher. The guys who ran the comic shops couldn't care less who they hired. They were hiring 14-year-old kids and stuff like that to draw comics. Yeah, you know. And so what a lot of these black artists would do is they would get their assignment from the publisher or from the packager. They would take it home, do it in their own studio. They'd come back and drop it off at the comic shop, and he would turn it in. So they never even worked, in many cases, with the white artists in their own studio. And that's why a lot of the white artists from the 1940s said there was no black artists working in the 1940s because they physically never even met them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's why it ended up, that's why I called the book Invisible Men. They were invisible literally even to the people they were working with.
That's incredible.
It is, wow. Isn't it? I mean, it's a whole, when you read this book, you'll see it's a whole dynamic there. It's this bubble mm-hmm. that, existed like that. And that's why, we have this false history that there was no blacks working in comic books. Only reason why people knew Matt Baker is because Matt Baker was one of the few, him and Alvin Hollingsworth, who physically worked in a comic studio with the white artist. And that was because both of them were really, really good. And the guys who ran the studios wanted them right on site. Matt Baker turned out a huge amount of work in the late 1940s. And he sat right next to Al Feldstein. And I interviewed Al Feldstein for this book years ago before he passed away. And he literally sat right next to Matt Baker. He said that people would stand around and just watch Baker draw. The other artists would. They said because he was so good. They'd just stand there, and he was like the star of the studio at the time. So he'd do the penciling, and then he'd hand it off to these other guys, and they'd ink it.
Wow, that's incredible. And it's a great way to come up with a title. Invisible Man, that's perfect.
Well, it's also references Ralph Ellison's classic book, Invisible Man, which mm-hmm. I start the book off with a quote from it, and I end the book with a quote from it. Because that's what he references, too, is he talked about how you could be a black person was invisible to white people at the time. And if you want to get a little more deeply into it, I don't know if you know how deep you want to go here, but
let's go. Okay.
Blacks at the time, they lived what it's called a dual consciousness. And that comes from a 1903 essay written by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was this great black civil rights leader and one of the first ones in the early 1900s. And he wrote about a double consciousness in the sense of that blacks live in two different worlds. They lived in their own world amongst, other blacks in the black community, like the people they live with and stuff like that, their families. Mm-hmm. Then they had to learn how to live in the white world and deal with white people who didn't even acknowledge them in most cases. The biggest, the largest form of employment in 1940 for blacks was as porters on trains. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's in people, white people wouldn't even associate with blacks in the sense of like, they wouldn't even see them. Here's the guy who just carries my bags, or here's the guy who might be working as a busboy in a restaurant who just cleans off the table or something like that. They never physically even dealt with blacks in the same way. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
You know, and that's why, you know, they were literally invisible to the white people they lived amongst. You know, and you know, it was ironic because a lot of whites would say like, "Oh, I'm not racist or anything," but they didn't even associate with blacks. It wasn't you know, any communication between the two.
Yeah, and that it's such a weird time to think of because we don't live like that now in that regard. It's something that, you know, it's just you can't relate to, you know, with those times because it's just not that way. But
see, go ahead. I'm sorry. No, I was saying, and that doesn't take into account the things like the Jim Crow laws that they had in certain parts of the country where blacks physically weren't allowed to be. I mean, that even impacted comics to a certain extent because, like for instance, here's a good for instance. Matt Baker created a character called Vooda, and I don't know if you've gotten to that portion of the book yet, but Vooda was the first black hero in comic books to have his own feature. It was 1945. There'd never been a black character to have its own feature in a comic book. Well, Matt Baker created this guy, and Vooda was basically like a black Tarzan, you know, and actually a black man in the jungle who's, you know, a big, you know, heroic hero, just like Tarzan was. Because most of the comic books at that time would have characters who were, you know, white guys who were, you know, white jungle lords. Well, this was a black jungle lord, okay, which sounds great, okay. He appeared in a comic called Crown Comics. I just happen to have it right here. Okay, you see the cover of this comic?
Yep. Actually, I'm going to zoom in on you so we can take a look at that.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, you see the cover of that comic there? You see what's going on?
Yeah.
Okay, that comic there had the first story of Vooda in it, who's this black hero. Well, each issue of Crown Comics afterward had Vooda on the cover, but he was colored white. He would be black on the interior and white on the cover. And the reason why they did that was because they, in the South, distributors and retailers refused to handle a comic that had a black as a positive character on the cover. So they'd have to change the color on the cover to even be able to put it on the newsstand.
Yeah.
And then 6 issues in, they changed the color of Vooda to white inside too, because it wasn't selling.
That's incredible.
Isn't it? I mean, like I say, it's hard for us to understand that in, like I've told people, I said, during my research of this book, reading all the black media that I did, because I literally read thousands of newspapers, black newspapers, I was embarrassed many times reading it because it's like, how could I not know this stuff? You know, how come this, you know, you don't hear these things in history discussed and stuff like that. It's one thing to hear it abstractly where they talk about Jim Crow laws or something like that. But to see the, you know, read contemporaneous articles and see the physical effect, the real life effect it had on the average person, the average black person at the time, is pretty, I don't know, it's very impactful. And again, that's something I hope people get out of this book, Nile, because I wrote it not just for comic book fans, but a much bigger audience. And that's kind of the response I've been getting, because I'm getting responses from people who have absolutely no contact with comic books, and they're thanking me for writing this book, which is great. Really makes me happy.
Well, it's an exposure that needs to be there because, like you said, you know, you were almost embarrassed to know this was going on. You had no clue, because that's the problem is you know, obviously as generations move on, things change. So you're almost, you know, either it's, you know, completely put behind everyone. They don't want to relive it. They don't want to talk about it. You don't truly know about it yet. When it comes to, you know, other families who had to grow up with that, black families and things that have passed down the things that happened. I mean, it's different for them. It's different because they did experience certain things that obviously we did not, because we're white, Caucasian, whatever you want to call it. But, you know, that passes with them. Where for us, we don't hear that because they didn't make it relevant for us.
Exactly.
No, the day to day. So by reading all the local articles, digging into the newspapers, you're getting the day to day life.
Exactly. And see, like they always say, you know, there's that old axiom that journalism is the first draft of history. Is true.
Yeah.
And see, that's why I do my own primary source research, is because I get that. I get that immediate impact that you don't get reading an article in a book that somebody else has wrote, because at that point you're getting it filtered through somebody else's viewpoint. And perspective has a lot to do with all this. I feel that like every school in this country should have, every history class should have at least part of the class told from the Black perspective, in the sense of like, not from somebody writing now, but just read these newspaper articles, read these newspapers and stuff. And now I can guarantee you that a lot of people would change their minds on a lot of things if they could actually see the real life impact of what was going on during that time. It does. It's really a really powerful learning experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is that in your book. There, and from what I've gone through, you get those impacts and understanding those things in your book. And speaking of that, I mean, with the artists that you have in here, the ones that you highlight, is there any one in particular that just stood out for you?
Well, each one of them has their own story. And it's interesting to see how each one, came to work in comics. But to me, the most impressive one, I think, is Elmer Stoner, because he was this Harlem Renaissance painter, he was classically trained, I should say, in he'd been to France and studied in France, art in France and everything. And he came back in 1922 and he moved to Harlem, and he participated in the first art show of Negro artists at the time. It was at the Harlem Library that they ever had in this country. And he was a highly respected fine artist in the Black community. He actually ended up working mostly in white publications, so he was unusual in that aspect as a commercial artist. And he did some pulp drawing in that during the 1930s, but just like so many others, he ended up out in the street in the late 30s. And in 1939, he's the first acknowledged Black artist to start working in comic books. And he ended up being like the conduit for a lot of other Black artists who came along afterwards to get jobs. And I found several articles that reference that he helped other Black artists get jobs with these comic shops in comic books. Guys like Alvin Hollingsworth and I assume like Owen Middleton and several others in that. And Stoner did he did a huge one. He's a hugely prolific artist during the Golden Age, and most of his artwork hasn't been properly identified yet. I mean, he literally did every cover for Fox publications from 1944 to 46, every single cover. Oh wow! Yeah, if you look at like the Grand Comics database, there's only maybe a dozen that are identified as being Elmer Stoner, but he did cover up every single one. He did the Blue Beetle for most of its most popular period during the mid 40s. He did a lot of these comics that nobody even gives him credit for. He worked for Dell. He worked for Street and Smith. He worked for Vital Publications. And he ended up doing a ton of promo comics after he left mainstream comics. Because just like all these other Black artists, at the end of World War II, when the white artists came back, they started getting the jobs. And the Black artists, all except for Matt Baker and Hollingsworth, all the rest basically stopped getting jobs. So Stoner to me is the most impressive one, because he had the greatest impact on the other artists who came along afterwards.
Yeah. And I mean, from going through the book, I mean, some of these artists, I mean, they've worked on some of, like you said, like Blue Beetle, some of the most well-known characters of the time, the most popular characters of the time. And what's cool too is in the book, like J. Paul Jackson and his work that they show, especially he did look like he did a lot of cartoon stuff, a lot of more of a cartoon strip. And I mean, but like look at the, I don't want to show off too much of the book, so I like people to buy it and see it for themselves. But I mean, again, such talented men, absolutely talented creators, in their right. And you can see that their style though, because you like you said, they almost, you worked in a comic shop, right? It was like the animation studios, right? It was just like a big sweatshop of like, get it
That's
done, get it
exactly
done,
what they
get it
were.
out,
They
get it out.
call them sweatshops. Yeah.
Yeah. But all these guys do, when you look at their own stuff, have their own unique style. But if you pay attention, and if you are a true comics fan that has, and you are focused on artists and really dig into, certain styles and who they are, you do see like similarities, which makes you wonder, well, obviously, Paul was before, so-and-so, but it looks a bit similar. So, I mean, their works had to have inspired some of these creators.
Oh, sure. I mean, right. They were obviously aware of what was going on in comic books. And at the same time, other artists were aware of what they were doing too. I mean, it's just like, nowadays, nothing happens in a vacuum, Nile. Everybody affects everybody else. But J. Paul Jackson, it's funny you mentioned him. Unfortunately, the books only could contain so much, material in it. But he did a whole continuity. He had a comic strip that he drew called Speed Jackson that ran in Chicago Defender. Okay. And Chicago Defender is this large black newspaper. Well, it ran for years, but there was a continuity in the strip, a 6-month continuity where Speed Jackson goes and finds this lost civilization in Africa, highly advanced civilization in Africa. It's basically Wakanda. Yeah. Okay, this is 1944, 1945. Now, I'm not saying, Lee and Kirby, stole the idea from him, but he had the same idea 20 years before.
Yeah.
It's stuff like that.
It's one of those things, like, because like I know when I started off doing comics and things and stuff like that, one of the best advice I was given by a fellow creator was, because a lot of people are like, hey, read this, read that. And he goes, my rule is if you're not published, I'm not going to read your work because I don't subconsciously want to take your idea.
Right.
And that's like the fear. And I bet you growing up, because this, he's 20 years prior, maybe he read, this or read that, and subconsciously, you're trying to create your own thing, and then you're creating basically the identical thing 20 years later, or right out knowing it. And it's like, oh, well, that was 20 years
chances are they never saw that though, because it was in a black newspaper. And see, again, there's these two bubbles, these two different worlds. Yeah. I mean, white creators would never be reading a black newspaper. Why would they? There's almost no reason for them to. Yet the black creators would be aware of what was going on with the white creators. It was like I say, it's an interesting dichotomy that was going on at the time.
That's very cool. And then how many artists are we looking at in your book? What's
18.
The total? 18.
Yeah, but there's still more. I mean, I've found since I've completed the book, I found more. Matter of fact, I'm still writing articles today. I have a Invisible Men blog that I do, and I'm adding to it all the time. I've had to sort of put it on pause while I'm doing all these interviews right now. But just in the past couple of weeks, I found 2 or 3 more artists who came along later in the 50s. And see, we had to stop the book at a certain point. And I artificially picked 1950 because, again, I only had so many pages to work with. But there was many more black artists in the 1950s who came along from like 1950 on. It was like a different generation. And then from after Matt Baker died in 1960, there's no black artists working in comics to the 1970s. Even during, the midst of the boom of the Silver Age and all that, there was no black comic book artist in the mainstream comics. Yet they were out there, It's just the way the world, I mean, it's hard to understand that, but at the same time, the whole civil rights thing was going on here in the 1960s, which I remember well. I said, I'm 68 years old, so I remember all this stuff going on. Comic books didn't have black artists, which is weird, even thinking about it, but there weren't any.
Yeah. That's incredible to have that span, like a whole decade of no black artists or that you haven't found yet, maybe. But so do you think that down the road, do you want to do a sequel or an addition onto this book?
I definitely do. Yeah. See, it took a while to find anybody who wanted to publish this. Okay. My kind of stuff is really esoteric. And in the sense, like, I don't write about popular artists. I write about artists most of the time other people haven't heard of. I just wrote a big article about a guy named Tony Brutso. You know who Tony Brutso is?
Never heard of him. No.
Never heard of him. Okay. Tony Brutso was a fantastic romance comic artist. You've heard of Roy Lichtenstein, right?
Yes.
Half of Roy Lichtenstein paintings are based on panels from Tony Brutso comic books. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a
So
whole.
where are you posting these articles? I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Where are you posting all these articles?
Well, I have right now, sometimes I'll put stuff on Facebook. I have 2 blogs going right now. One's called Invisible Men Blog, a WordPress thing. And then the other one is called The Comics Detective. Okay. That's what people have called me for years, Comics Detective. And I started a blog by that name because of the type of work I do. I don't like calling myself a historian because like I tell people, I don't have the bona fides to do that. I'm not a professor and, have the degrees on the wall and all that stuff. What I do is just journalistic digging, and I put it all together, and, it's following clues all the time. So it's like detective work I do. And so if you put in comicsdetective.com, that's my blog. All
right. And what we'll do is we'll add those web addresses to the description of this interview on our channel. Okay. So if any of the viewers out there, you want to explore deeper into some of Ken's articles and work, you can do that and discover, just like I just discovered a new artist literally right now that I was not familiar with. I will find myself going to his blogs and catching up, because there's nothing, especially if you are an artist, to just dig through, artists you don't know and sifting through their portfolios. It's very inspiring. There's so many talented people out there you don't know about.
Right. And Tony Brutso is particularly interesting in that because he was so talented, but he was also gay. And at the time he was drawing comic books, like in the 50s and 60s, nobody else even knew him until I finally found Barbara Friedlander, who was who worked as an editor at DC Romance Comics in the late 60s, knew him, and she confirmed the fact. But he wouldn't even work in the offices and stuff because there was that whole thing, where he was ostracized because he was gay and stuff. He had been a fashion illustrator prior to World War II, and that was his field. He was a well-known fashion illustrator, and he went on to work in comic books and did some gorgeous work. Check it out sometime. If you want to, check out his story on my Comics Detective blog, but you'll see tremendous artist. Tremendous.
Yeah, we'll check that out. Definitely. Maybe if you don't mind, we may even like to have you back on, maybe explore some of your articles and just talk about some other creators that people aren't familiar with, other artists and stuff.
You better be careful. You get me talking about all this stuff, I'd be on here for days, but okay.
hey, we love doing that. We love it. Why not? Why not get some exposure out there for, artists, living or deceased that deserve the.
Oh, they do. There's so many talented artists who worked in this field, Nile, that, it's a shame that we only focused on so few. A lot that just depends upon the genre. Tony Brutso never worked in romance comics, but he literally worked with John Romita. The reason why we know John Romita is because he left romance comics and started working in superhero comics. Yeah.
Well, superheroes took over, the romance, the crime, the horror, all that, especially too with, the comic code that changed so much of it too. And then, you got those honky superhero comics, the 50s and stuff. And it wasn't until, really, I would say, Stan Lee and them and their writing and kind of what they did to change the characters and
people have this skewed view of comics history. I mean, one of my biggest arguments I've had with people over the years is like people always say that the silver age of comics started with Showcase number 4 in 1956. Yeah. Well, that's ridiculous because it has nothing to do with anything. Yeah, they, DC revamped an old character and gave him a new costume and origin in 1956, but it didn't start a whole popularity of superheroes. Yeah, it took years. I mean, it wasn't until the Justice League came on along in 1960 it started gaining popularity. Then in late 1961 with Fantastic Four, that's when Silver Age started. Yeah. Between that time, the biggest selling comics were Dell Comics. And it's not even close. I mean, Walt Disney Comics and Stories sold much more than any superhero comic.
Yeah. Well, they were the throwaway stuff parents bought for their kids to occupy their time.
And like I said, I lived during that time. I know that. I remember that.
Did you keep them? Do you still have any of them?
I do. I mean, again, you know, God bless my mother. And you know, she put up with this obsessiveness of mine and stuff. And I still got Fantastic Four #1 and Spider-Man #1 and all that stuff like that.
Now, growing up, if you had to pick, you know, with the main two, did you gravitate towards the DC books more or the Marvel books more?
Yeah, I bought everything. I got my first job in 1967. Okay, that tells you how old I am. But in May of 1967, just to give you an idea, Nile, the new record that came out that month was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Okay, that's when I started my first job. Anyway, during that time, from 1967 to 1975, I bought every comic book that was on the newsstand. I would go into the drugstore and take 1 copy of every comic book and 2 copies of any #1 issue. And I did that for 8 years, you know, during that time period. I was ridiculous how many comics.
So you probably have a few gems in the collection then with that time period.
Oh, well, most of those I've sold off over years because my interest is more in the golden age. And I got some really obscure, rare stuff too in the golden age. Again, if you look at my blogs, you'll see things that you've never seen before. And I can guarantee that. I put up stuff all the time. People say, where the heck did you get that?
Well, that's cool, Ken. That's awesome. That's awesome. I may even pick your brain on that. Hey, Ken, let's do a show. Just show us all the weird books you have.
I'll be happy to do
weird books.
You should ask me about Will Eisner. Heck, I could do a month of Will Eisner. It's ridiculous.
We actually have that in the schedule. It was Danny Fingeroth. We were going to do something with him on Will Eisner and all that stuff. And then COVID and all that happened, and it pushed everything back. We're gonna. If it was was it an anniversary in 2020 for Will Eisner?
No, he was born in 1917, so I don't know.
No, it was for. I know what it was.
Oh, The Spirit.
Yeah,
started in 1940, so it would have been an anniversary. It would have been the 80th anniversary. Yeah,
correct. So we were going to do a Will Eisner special, but then that didn't pan out. But Ken, I just want to thank you again for coming on and chatting with me about this great book. Now, where this book is pretty much sold wherever you can buy books.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you know, people have been buying it mostly like through Amazon and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But personally, I would prefer if they go through their local comic shop just to help those guys out. Yeah, you know.
And this is published through IDW, correct?
Well, it's Yo Books, Craig Yo.
Yep.
He's an imprint of IDW.
Okay.
So it's like, you know, he's an imprint IDW. So they're the overseers of what we do. But it's thanks to Craig that book exists. Because he's the one who took the chance on me to even even hope that somebody would buy it. Because believe me, when I first proposed this and that, it's kind of like, I don't know, but we'll see.
No. So far, I mean, it's been a fantastic read. I highly recommend anyone out there, especially if you're into comic book history, pick up a copy. It's even just the quality of the book. I mean, the cover feels great. The pages are nice. I mean, inside, you know, there's so much stuff in the book. Pieces that you've taken, it's very well written. Kudos to you, Ken. You did an absolute phenomenal job on this book. And,
thank you.
I know so many people that have ordered it and are starting to receive it. I don't know where they're getting it from, probably Amazon because it's convenient. I'm not going to lie, but they are purchasing it, and definitely, I think you've got a success on your hands here. I think that I'm going to be looking forward to the sequel to this book.
Well, I hope there is one.
All right, Ken, thank you so much. I look forward to having you back on the show. And everyone, if you enjoyed this interview and you want to see more, please click that subscribe button and remember to smash the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. So everyone, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all in the next one. Thank you.